Welcome back to another journey through the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war. Tonight, we're exploring one of the most significant chapters in the history of the Imperium of Man. The Ultramarines, the 13th Legion, and the sacred tome that would reshape the very structure of humanity's greatest defenders for 10,000 years, the Codex Astartes. Before we begin this exploration of duty, discipline, and the weight of legacy, if you enjoy these deep dives into Warhammer lore, hitting that subscribe button really helps the channel grow. Now, settle in as we unravel the story of the legion that held the Imperium together when it stood on the precipice of annihilation, and the book that would define what it meant to be a space marine for millennia to come. The Ultramarines stand as perhaps the most celebrated chapter in the entire Adeptus Astartes. Their blue armor is recognized across 1,000,000 worlds. Their deeds are inscribed in devotional texts from one end of the galaxy to the other. Statues of their Primarch, Roboute Guilliman, tower over countless plazas and city gates. Images of their victories glow from stained glass windows in the mightiest basilicas. But this fame, this reverence, wasn't simply handed to them. It was earned through blood, sacrifice, and an unwavering commitment to a vision of what the Space Marines could and should be. To understand the Ultramarines, we must first understand their origins, their Primarch, and the galaxy-spanning conflict that would test them beyond all measure. We must journey back to the Great Crusade, to a time when the Emperor of Mankind walked among his sons, when 20 legions of transhuman warriors conquered the stars in his name, and when the dream of a unified human empire seemed within reach. Chapter 1. The Warborn. The story of the Ultramarines begins not with glory, but with absence. While the other legions of the Great Crusade were already carving their names into history, fighting alongside their Primarchs in the Emperor's grand vision of galactic conquest, the 13th Legion remained curiously low profile. They were called the Warborn in those early days, a name that spoke to their origins but revealed little of their destiny. The Warborn were created during the First Founding, that momentous period in the early 30th millennium when the Emperor, working with the scientists of the Biotechnical Division, created the first Space Marine legions, using genetic material derived from the still unborn Primarchs, those 20 extraordinary superhuman sons he had crafted in his gene laboratories deep beneath the Himalayan mountains. The Emperor forged his ultimate warriors. The Warborn were the 13th of these legions, and from the beginning they were different. While other legions drew their recruits from specific regions of Terra or from particular warrior cultures, the Warborn cast a wider net. They scoured Terra for the best candidates they could find, regardless of origin. This wasn't random selection. It was systematic, methodical, an approach that prioritized quality and potential over tradition or regional loyalty. Even in these early days, before they had met their Primarch, the 13th Legion displayed the organizational thinking that would later define them. The Warborn's first major engagement came during the first pacification of Luna, humanity's moon, which had become the domain of the Selenar gene cults. These ancient organizations possessed technology vital to expanding the numbers of the Legiones Astartes, but they rejected the Emperor's diplomatic overtures. 3 nascent Space Marine legions were unleashed to force compliance. The 7th, 13th, and 16th legions, later to be known as the Imperial Fists, Ultramarines, and Luna Wolves respectively, lifted from Terra's surface in a scattering of rocket flame. The 16th Legion served as vanguard, launching a daring planetary strike while their brother legions drew fire from Luna's defensive weapons. Within 6 hours of the first shot being fired, Luna had been pacified. It was humanity's first off-world conquest, a statement of intent that echoed across the solar system. The Warborn had proven themselves capable, disciplined, effective, but they remained in the shadow of more celebrated legions, waiting for something that would transform them from competent warriors into something far greater. That transformation came with the discovery of their Primarch. The Primarchs, those 20 superhuman sons of the Emperor, had been scattered across the galaxy by the machinations of the Chaos Gods while still in their gestation pods. Each landed on a different world, grew to maturity in wildly different circumstances, and shaped the cultures they found themselves in. Some landed on death worlds, where only the strongest survived. Others found themselves on planets consumed by war, where violence was the only language spoken. The Primarch of the 13th Legion landed on Macragge, a world in the eastern fringe of the galaxy, in the realm that would come to be known as Ultramar. Macragge was not a death world. It was not a planet of endless war or brutal survival. It was a civilized world, governed by a system of laws and led by a ruling class that valued order, efficiency, and the welfare of its citizens. The infant Primarch was discovered by Conor Tarasha, one of Macragge's 2 consuls, who adopted the child and named him Roboute. The boy grew at a superhuman rate, as all Primarchs did, but his development was shaped by the culture of Macragge in ways that would prove crucial to his future role. Roboute Guilliman, as he came to be known, didn't just grow physically. He absorbed knowledge with a hunger that amazed even his adoptive father. He studied history, philosophy, military strategy, governance, logistics, economics. Every aspect of civilization fascinated him. By the time he reached physical maturity, which
took only a handful of years, he had become the greatest warrior, strategist, and statesman on Macragge. His mind was a weapon as formidable as his transhuman body, capable of processing vast amounts of information, identifying patterns, and formulating solutions with a speed and accuracy that seemed almost supernatural. But Guilliman's early life was not without tragedy. His adoptive father, Conor, was beloved by the people, but had enemies among the nobility. These rivals, led by Conor's co-consul Galen, orchestrated a rebellion. Conor was assassinated, and Macragge descended into civil war. Guilliman, still young but already a formidable leader, rallied those loyal to his father's memory. He crushed the rebellion with a combination of military brilliance and political acumen, bringing the traitors to justice and assuming leadership of Macragge himself. Under Guilliman's rule, Macragge flourished. He reformed its government, streamlined its bureaucracy, improved its infrastructure, and expanded its influence to neighboring worlds. He didn't conquer through brute force alone.
He offered the benefits of civilization, of order and prosperity, and most worlds joined Macragge's growing empire willingly. Those that didn't were brought into compliance through military action that was swift, efficient, and designed to minimize casualties on both sides. Guilliman understood that conquered people who were treated well became loyal citizens, while those who were brutalized became eternal enemies. This was the man the Emperor found when he finally reached Macragge. The journey had been delayed by warp storms, those unpredictable tempests in the Imperium that could throw ships off course by years or even decades. By the time the Emperor's fleet arrived in the Ultramar system, Guilliman had been ruling for almost 5 years. The Emperor found not a feral warrior king or a battle-scarred survivor, but a sophisticated leader who had built a thriving interstellar civilization. The meeting between the Emperor and Guilliman was different from his reunions with other Primarchs. There was no need to prove his identity through feats of strength or displays of power. Guilliman recognized his creator immediately, understood on some fundamental level that this was the being who had made him and for whom he had been made. The Emperor, for his part, was impressed by what his son had accomplished. Macragge was self-sufficient, prosperous, with a strong and well-equipped military, engaging in trade with nearby systems. It was everything the Emperor hoped to build across the galaxy, achieved by a single individual in just a few years. The Emperor assigned command of the 13th Legion to Guilliman and relocated the Legion's forward base to Macragge. The Warborn became the Ultramarines, named for the realm of Ultramar that Guilliman had built, and for their role as the ultimate Marines, the exemplars of what the Legiones Astartes could achieve. The transformation was immediate and dramatic. Guilliman brought to his legion the same organizational genius he'd applied to Macragge. He studied the Warborn's existing structure, identified inefficiencies, and implemented reforms. He established training protocols that emphasized not just combat prowess, but tactical flexibility and strategic thinking. He created supply chains that ensured his warriors were always properly equipped. He developed recruitment standards that maintained the Legion's quality while allowing for rapid expansion. Most importantly, he instilled in his sons a culture that valued discipline, duty, and the greater good above personal glory. The Ultramarines began to grow, not just in numbers, though they certainly expanded rapidly, but in capability and reputation. They didn't just conquer worlds, they left those worlds better than they found them, establishing governments, building infrastructure, integrating conquered populations into the Imperium in ways that made rebellion unlikely. Other legions might boast of how many worlds they had brought into compliance, but the Ultramarines could point to how many of those worlds remained compliant, how many thrived under Imperial rule, how many contributed to the Great Crusade, rather than draining resources through constant rebellion. This approach required more than just military might. It required administrators, engineers, teachers, diplomats. Guilliman understood that the Great Crusade wasn't just about conquest. It was about building an empire that would endure. He trained his Ultramarines to think beyond the immediate battle,
to consider the long-term consequences of their actions. A city destroyed in battle was a city that couldn't contribute to the Imperium. Civilians killed in collateral damage were potential recruits, workers, and taxpayers lost forever. Victory wasn't just about defeating the enemy. It was about achieving strategic objectives with minimum expenditure of resources, both imperial and enemy. This philosophy extended even to how the Ultramarines fought. They avoided battles of attrition when possible, preferring surgical strikes that decapitated enemy leadership or destroyed critical infrastructure. They used overwhelming force when necessary, but preferred to achieve compliance through demonstration of power rather than its application. They were willing to accept enemy surrender and integrate former foes into the imperial military structure. This wasn't mercy in the traditional sense. It was pragmatism. Dead enemies couldn't serve the Imperium. Living ones, properly motivated and supervised, could. The Ultramarines' approach proved extraordinarily effective. By the time of the Horus Heresy, the 13th Legion had grown to become the largest of all the Loyalist legions, numbering approximately 250,000 Space Marines. This wasn't just due to Guilliman's recruitment efficiency, though that certainly played a role. It was also because the Ultramarines
Suffered fewer casualties than other legions. Their careful planning, their emphasis on achieving objectives with minimum loss, their willingness to retreat and regroup rather than fight to the last man. All of these factors meant that Ultramarines who went into battle were more likely to come out alive. This size and success bred resentment among some of the other legions. The World Eaters, who gloried in close combat and measured success by the number of enemies killed in melee, viewed the Ultramarines' methodical approach as cowardly. The Night Lords, who used terror as a weapon and left worlds traumatized by their passage, saw Guilliman's emphasis on winning hearts and minds as weakness. Even some of the Loyalist legions found the Ultramarines' success grating. The Imperial Fists, proud of their own discipline and organization, bristled at the implication that the Ultramarines did it better. The Space Wolves, who valued individual heroism and personal glory, found the Ultramarines' emphasis on collective achievement and subordination of ego to be stifling. But Guilliman didn't concern himself overmuch with what his brothers thought of his methods. He had a job to do, a vision to implement, and the results spoke for themselves. The Ultramarines conquered more worlds than any legion except the Luna Wolves, and they left those worlds in better condition than any other legion. The realm of Ultramar expanded to encompass hundreds of worlds, each contributing to the legion's strength through recruits, resources, and industrial capacity. Guilliman was building not just a military force, but a self-sustaining empire within the Imperium, a model for what human civilization could achieve under proper leadership. The Ultramarines also pioneered new organizational structures. As the Legion grew beyond 100,000 warriors, Guilliman found that the traditional company structure was insufficient for managing such a vast force. he created a new level of organization called a chapter, a formation of roughly 10,000 space marines that could operate independently while remaining part of the larger legion. Each chapter had its own command structure, its own support elements, its own identity. This allowed the Ultramarines to fight on multiple fronts simultaneously, to respond to threats across a vast region of space, to be everywhere they were needed without requiring Guilliman's personal presence at every engagement. This chapter system was revolutionary. Other legions had experimented with various organizational structures, but none had formalized it to the degree Guilliman did. He wrote extensive documentation on how chapters should be organized, how they should interact with each other, how they should coordinate their efforts while maintaining operational independence. He created a system that was flexible enough to adapt to different situations, but structured enough to ensure consistency and efficiency. It was, in many ways, a preview of what would come after the heresy. Though Guilliman didn't know it at the time, the Ultramarines' success during the Great Crusade established them as one of the preeminent legions. They were respected, if not always liked, by their brother legions. They were trusted by the Emperor, who valued Guilliman's reliability and competence. They were admired by the Imperial Army regiments who fought alongside them, who appreciated that the Ultramarines actually cared about minimizing friendly casualties and achieving objectives, rather than just racking up kill counts. The 13th Legion had transformed from the relatively obscure Warborn into a force that embodied the best of what the Great Crusade was supposed to achieve. But this success, this growth, this prominence would make them a target when the Imperium tore itself apart. Chapter 2: The Betrayal at Calth. The Horus Heresy shattered the Imperium. Fully half of the Space Marine legions turned traitor, following the War Master Horus in his rebellion against the Emperor. The galaxy descended into civil war, brother fighting brother. The dream of a unified human empire consumed by flames of treachery and ambition. The Ultramarines, loyal to the Emperor and committed to the ideals of the Great Crusade, found themselves targeted by those who had once been allies. The Word-Bearers Legion, led by the Primarch Lorgar, harbored a particular hatred for the Ultramarines. This enmity had roots that stretched back years before the heresy began. Lorgar had built his legion around faith, around worship of the Emperor as a god. He had constructed vast cathedrals on conquered worlds, established religions centered on imperial divinity, turned compliance into conversion. But the Emperor rejected this worship. He had fought to free humanity from the shackles of religion, to establish a secular imperium based on reason and science. Lorgar's actions directly contradicted this vision. The Emperor ordered the Ultramarines to make an example. Guilliman led his legion to Monarchia, the Word-Bearer's greatest achievement. a city of soaring spires and magnificent temples, a monument to faith and devotion. The Ultramarines razed it to the ground. They didn't kill the inhabitants, evacuating them first, but they destroyed every building, every statue, every symbol of the religion Lorgar had built. Then they forced the word-bearers to kneel in the ashes of their greatest work, while the Emperor himself rebuked Lorgar for his failures. The humiliation was total. The word-bearers never forgave it. Lorgar never forgave Guilliman. When the heresy began, when Lorgar and his legion turned to chaos, the word-bearers made destroying the Ultramarines a priority, second only to killing the Emperor himself. They would have their revenge for Monarchia, and it would be written in the blood of the 13th Legion. The trap was set at Calth, a world in the Ultramar system. The word-bearers requested a meeting with the Ultramarines, claiming they needed to coordinate for a joint campaign. Guilliman, despite his strategic brilliance, didn't suspect treachery. The heresy was still in its early stages. The full scope of the betrayal wasn't yet clear. The idea that a brother Primarch would attack without provocation seemed unthinkable. So Guilliman agreed. He mustered a significant portion of his legion at Calth, preparing to march alongside the word-bearers in what he believed would be a campaign of conquest. The word-bearers arrived in force. Their fleet filled Calth's orbit. Their warriors made planetfall in massive numbers. Everything seemed normal. The usual preparations for a major military operation. The Ultramarines welcomed their cousins, prepared to fight alongside them as they had during the Great Crusade. It was a pleasant day in Ultramar, the kind of day that made you grateful to be alive, to be part of something greater than yourself. Then the word-bearers opened fire. The attack was sudden, brutal, and devastating. Word-bearers' ships in orbit turned their weapons on Ultramarines' vessels, crippling or destroying them before they could respond. On the planet's surface, word-bearers' warriors who had been standing shoulder to shoulder with Ultramarines moments before began killing their supposed allies. The betrayal was total, coordinated, and executed with a precision that spoke to months or even years of planning. But the word-bearers had made a critical miscalculation. They had assumed that surprise would be enough, that the Ultramarines would be so shocked by the betrayal that they would be unable to mount an effective defense. They were wrong. The Ultramarines were disciplined, trained to respond to unexpected situations, led by officers who could think clearly even in the midst of chaos. The initial attack inflicted terrible casualties, but it didn't break the 13th Legion. Guilliman himself was on the surface when the attack began. He was in a meeting with word-bearers' commanders when they revealed their treachery. The Primarch of the 13th Legion responded with a fury that few had ever witnessed. He killed the traitors with his bare hands, tearing through them with a violence that seemed at odds with his usual measured demeanor. Then he fought his way to his flagship, the Macragge's Honor, rallying his sons as he went. The battle for Calth was one of the bloodiest engagements of the entire heresy. The word-bearers had numerical superiority and the advantage of surprise. But the Ultramarines had discipline, determination, and a Primarch who refused to accept defeat. The fighting raged across the planet's surface, through its cities, in the void above. Ultramarines and word-bearers clashed in brutal close combat, in tank battles, in void warfare. The casualties on both sides were staggering. The word-bearers had another weapon, one that went beyond conventional military force. They had turned to chaos, made pacts with the ruinous powers, learned sorcery and summoned demons. During the battle, they enacted a ritual of terrible power. They poisoned Calth's sun, turning it into a weapon that would eventually kill everything on the planet's surface. They conjured the Ruin Storm, a massive warp tempest that cut the galaxy in half, preventing the Ultramarines from reinforcing Terra or even communicating with the rest of the Imperium. But even these apocalyptic weapons weren't enough to destroy the Ultramarines. As Calth's surface became uninhabitable, the survivors retreated into the planet's vast underground arcologies. The battle continued in the darkness, in tunnels and chambers carved from living rock. Small units of Ultramarines hunted word-bearers through the subterranean maze. It was during this phase of the battle that Sergeant Aenid Thiel, an Ultramarines veteran, pioneered new tactics for fighting traitor Marines. Thiel had been censured before the battle for the crime of theorizing about how to fight other Space Marines. Such thoughts were considered treasonous, an acknowledgement that civil war was even possible. But when the word-bearers attacked, Thiel's theoretical exercises became practical necessity. He organized small, independent task forces called the Red Marked, units that could operate without direct command, adapting to situations as they arose. These red-marked squads proved devastatingly effective against the word-bearers, hunting them through Calth's underworld, eliminating them piece by piece. Guilliman took note of Thiel's innovations. After the battle, he met with the sergeant, listened to his reports, and then did something that would have profound implications for the future. He tore apart the documents on which he'd been writing his old tactical doctrines and declared that the Ultramarines would no longer be a horde under a warlord, but hundreds of thousands of individual legionaries, each in support of the other. The seeds of the Codex Astartes were planted in the ashes of Calth, born from betrayal and the need to adapt to a new kind of warfare. The word-bearers were eventually driven from Calth, but they had achieved their strategic objective. The Ultramarines had suffered catastrophic casualties. Tens of thousands of warriors were dead. The Legion's fleet was crippled. And most importantly, the Ruin Storm prevented Guilliman from reaching Terra. The largest Loyalist Legion, the force that might have turned the tide at the siege of Terra, was trapped in the Eastern Fringe, unable to intervene in the climactic battle that would determine the Imperium's fate. Guilliman's frustration was immense. He could see what was happening. He understood that Horus was moving against Terra, that the Emperor needed every loyal warrior he could get. But the Ruin Storm was impassable. Ships that tried to navigate it were lost, driven mad, or emerged decades or centuries off course. The Ultramarines were trapped, forced to watch helplessly as the Imperium burned. But Guilliman wasn't one to accept helplessness. If he couldn't reach Terra, he would ensure that there was still an Imperium to save when the ruin storm finally cleared. He began organizing the worlds of Ultramar into a cohesive whole, a functioning government that could survive even if Terra fell. He established supply lines, coordinated defenses, prepared for the possibility that the Ultramarines might be the last bastion of Imperial civilization. This effort expanded into something more ambitious. Working with his brother Primarch Sanguinius of the Blood Angels and Lion L. Johnson of the Dark Angels, who were also trapped by the ruin storm, Guilliman created Imperium Secundus, a second Imperium, with Sanguinius as its emperor. This wasn't rebellion or an attempt to supplant the emperor. It was contingency planning, preparation for the worst-case scenario. If Terra fell, if the emperor was killed, humanity would need a government, a military, a civilization to rally around. Imperium Secundus would be that civilization. The creation of Imperium Secundus was controversial, even among the Loyalists. Some saw it as necessary pragmatism. Others viewed it as defeatism or even treachery. Guilliman himself was conflicted. He didn't want to create a rival Imperium. He wanted to fight at his father's side, to defend Terra, to fulfill his duty as a son and a warrior. But he couldn't reach Terra, and doing nothing while the Imperium burned was unacceptable. So he built Imperium Secundus, a government in exile, a backup plan for humanity's survival. The ruin storm eventually dissipated, its power exhausted or its purpose fulfilled. Guilliman immediately mobilized the Ultramarines, preparing to race to Terra. But he was too late. By the time his fleet could reach the Sol system, the siege of Terra was already underway. Horus had breached the Imperial Palace. The Emperor and the War Master were locked in their final confrontation. The Ultramarines fought their way through a massive traitor fleet, destroying it in a series of brutal void engagements. But they couldn't reach Terra in time to affect the outcome. The Emperor struck down Horus, but was mortally wounded in the process. By the time Guilliman arrived, his father was already entombed in the Golden Throne, kept barely alive by arcane technology, unable to speak or move. His consciousness focused entirely on maintaining the Astronomicon and holding shut the webway breach beneath the Imperial Palace. The Imperium had survived, but at a cost that was almost too terrible to bear. Guilliman looked upon the shattered Imperium, the devastated Terra, the crippled Emperor, and understood that his work was just beginning. The war was over, but the aftermath would be just as challenging as the conflict itself. The Imperium needed to be rebuilt, reorganized, reformed. The Space Marine legions, which had proven capable of tearing the galaxy apart, needed to be restructured to prevent another civil war. The military, the bureaucracy,
The very foundations of imperial civilization needed to be reimagined for a future without the Emperor's direct guidance. And Guilliman, the master of organization, the builder of empires, the Primarch who had held Ultramar together when the galaxy burned, was the only one positioned to do it. Chapter 3: The Codex Astartes. In the aftermath of the Horus Heresy, the Imperium stood at a crossroads. The Emperor was entombed in the Golden Throne, alive but unable to lead. Fully half of the Space Marine legions had turned traitor and been driven into the Eye of Terror. Terra itself was devastated, its population decimated, its infrastructure in ruins. The dream of a unified human empire spanning the galaxy had been shattered, replaced by a nightmare of civil war and betrayal. The High Lords of Terra, a council of the Imperium's most powerful officials, found themselves the de facto rulers of humanity. But they were administrators, not warriors. They understood governance and bureaucracy, but they lacked the military expertise to reorganize the Imperium's armed forces. For that, they turned to Roboute Guilliman, who had been named Lord Commander of the Imperium and Imperial Regent, effectively making him the highest authority in the Imperium after the Emperor himself. Guilliman accepted this responsibility with characteristic determination. He understood that the Imperium's survival depended on preventing another heresy, on ensuring that no single individual could ever again command the kind of power that Horus had wielded. The Space Marine legions, those vast armies of transhuman warriors, had proven capable of conquering the galaxy. They had also proven capable of nearly destroying it. Something had to change. The solution Guilliman developed was radical, controversial, and would shape the Imperium for the next 10,000 years. He would break up the Space Marine legions, dividing them into smaller, more manageable units called chapters. Each chapter would number approximately 1,000 warriors, a fraction of a legion's strength. Each would be autonomous, answering only to the Emperor through the High Lords of Terra, not to their Primarch or any other single authority. No one person would ever again control tens of thousands of Space Marines. But organizational restructuring alone wasn't enough. Guilliman understood that the chapters would need guidance, a framework for how they should operate, fight, and maintain themselves. They would need standards for recruitment, training, equipment, tactics, and strategy. They would need a common doctrine that would allow chapters from different parts of the galaxy to work together effectively. They would need, in short, a comprehensive manual that covered every aspect of Space Marine operations. Guilliman set himself to writing this manual with the same intensity he had brought to every other task in his life. He drew on his decades of experience leading the Ultramarines, on the lessons learned during the Great Crusade and the Heresy, on his study of military history and theory. He consulted with other Primarchs, with veteran Space Marines, with Imperial Army commanders. He analyzed battles, identified what had worked and what hadn't, codified best practices, and warned against common mistakes. The result was the Codex Astartes, a tome of such comprehensive scope that it would take a lifetime to fully master. The Codex covered everything from the proper organization of a chapter to tactical doctrines for every conceivable battlefield situation. It included sections on recruitment and training, on the maintenance of equipment and vehicles, on the conduct of void warfare and planetary assaults. It addressed logistics and supply chains,
command structures and chains of authority, heraldry and unit markings. It was simultaneously a military manual, an organizational guide, and a philosophical treatise on what it meant to be a Space Marine. The opening passage of the Codex Astartes set the tone for everything that followed. They shall be pure of heart and strong of body, untainted by doubt and unsullied by self-aggrandizement. They will be bright stars on the firmament of battle, angels of death, whose shining wings bring swift annihilation to the enemies of man. So it shall be, for 1,000 times for 1,000 years, unto the very end of eternity, and the extinction of mortal flesh. This wasn't just military doctrine. It was a vision of what the Space Marines should aspire to be. Not conquerors seeking personal glory, not warlords building their own empires, but selfless defenders of humanity, warriors who subordinated their egos to the greater good. The Codex emphasized discipline over individual heroism, coordination over personal achievement, the mission's success over any single warrior's survival. The organizational structure the Codex prescribed was precise and comprehensive. A chapter would consist of 10 companies, each numbering 100 Space Marines plus officers and specialists. The first company would be composed of veterans, the chapter's most experienced warriors, including those qualified to wear Terminator armor. Companies 2 through 5 would be battle companies, combined arms formations capable of independent operations. Companies 6 through 9 would be reserve companies, specialized in specific combat roles and serving as a pool of reinforcements for the battle companies. The 10th company would consist of scouts, neophytes who had not yet received all their gene seed implants and were learning the ways of war. Each company would be led by a captain, supported by a chaplain who tended to the warrior's spiritual needs, an apothecary who maintained their physical health and harvested gene seed from the fallen, and a standard bearer who carried the company's banner into battle. The chapter as a whole would be led by a chapter master, typically the captain of the first company, who would be advised by a council of senior officers and specialists. The Codex also established standards for squad organization and markings. Squads would typically number 5 or 10 warriors, depending on their role. Tactical squads, the backbone of any chapter, would be marked with red trim and symbols. Assault squads, specializing in close combat, would bear yellow markings. Devastator squads, heavy weapons specialists, would be identified by blue. Each company would have its own color, displayed on the shoulder pad trim, allowing warriors from different companies to be identified at a glance. This level of standardization served multiple purposes. It allowed Space Marines from different chapters to work together seamlessly, understanding each other's organization and capabilities without lengthy explanations. It created a common culture across the Adeptus Astartes, a shared identity that transcended individual chapter loyalties. And it made it easier for Imperial commanders to integrate Space Marine forces into larger military operations,
knowing what to expect from a given unit. But the Codex Astartes was more than just organizational charts and unit markings. It contained extensive tactical doctrine, covering every type of warfare the Space Marines might encounter. There were sections on siege warfare, detailing how to assault fortified positions and how to defend them. There were chapters on stealth operations, on rapid strike tactics, on void warfare, on fighting in every conceivable environment from frozen ice worlds to volcanic hellscapes. For any given tactical situation, the Codex had hundreds of pages devoted to how it might be met and overcome. Guilliman drew heavily on his own experiences in writing these sections. The careful, methodical approach that had served the Ultramarines so well during the Great Crusade was codified into doctrine. The emphasis on achieving objectives with minimum casualties, on preserving force strength for future operations, on thinking beyond the immediate battle to consider strategic implications. All of this became part of the Codex's teachings, but Guilliman also incorporated lessons from other legions. The Imperial Fist's expertise in siege warfare was acknowledged and built upon. The Raven Guard's stealth tactics were analyzed and systematized. Even the tactics of the traitor legions, stripped of their chaos corruption, were studied for what they could teach about effective warfare. The Codex Astartes was meant to be the accumulated wisdom of the entire Legiones Astartes, not just the Ultramarines' way of war. The Codex also addressed the darker lessons of the heresy. It included extensive sections on identifying and combating chaos corruption, on recognizing the signs of heresy before it could take root. It emphasized the importance of faith in the Emperor, of loyalty to the Imperium, of subordinating personal ambition to duty. These sections were written with painful awareness of how easily even the greatest warriors could fall to temptation, how pride and ambition could corrupt even a Primarch. Perhaps most importantly, the Codex established strict controls over gene seed, the precious genetic material that allowed the creation of new Space Marines. Each chapter would be required to tie the portion of its gene seed to the Adeptus Terra, where it would be tested for purity and stored in genetic banks. This served multiple purposes. It allowed the Adeptus Terra to monitor chapters for genetic deviation or mutation. It created a strategic reserve of gene seed that could be used to found new chapters, and it gave the High Lords of Terra ultimate control over the creation of new Space Marines, ensuring that no single individual or organization could build a private army of Astartes. The implementation of the Codex Astartes was formalized through an event known as the Second Founding. The remaining Loyalist legions would be divided into chapters, with one chapter retaining the original legion's name, heraldry, and homeworld, while the others would take new identities and spread across the Imperium. This division occurred in 021.M31, 7 years after the end of the Horus Heresy. The Ultramarines, being the largest Loyalist legion, were divided into more chapters than any other. The exact number is disputed, but it was certainly more than 20, possibly as many as 30 or more. These successor chapters included the Aurora chapter, the Genesis chapter, the Nova Marines, the Patriarchs of Ulixis, and many others.
Each took a portion of the Ultramarines' gene seed, a cadre of veteran warriors to serve as its core, and went forth to establish its own identity and traditions. But while these successor chapters developed their own cultures and customs, they all remained bound by the Codex Astartes. They organized their companies according to its dictates, marked their squads according to its standards, fought according to its tactical doctrines. They were no longer Ultramarines, but they were all children of Guilliman, inheritors of his vision for what the Space Marines should be. The Codex Astartes was not universally embraced. Some Primarchs and their legions resisted the changes Guilliman proposed. The most notable opposition came from Roboute Dorn of the Imperial Fists, who initially refused to break up his legion. Dorn argued that the Imperium needed the legion's strength, that dividing them would weaken humanity's defenses at a time when the Imperium was still vulnerable. He called Guilliman a coward for not participating in the defense of Terra, while Guilliman accused Dorn of being a rebel for refusing the Codex. The dispute grew heated enough that a second civil war seemed possible. The Imperial Fist's strike cruiser Terrible Angel was fired upon by the Imperial Navy in connection with the Codex crisis. Other Primarchs took sides, with Leman Russ of the Space Wolves supporting Dorn, while Jagatai Khan of the White Scars and Korax of the Raven Guard backed
Guilliman. The Imperium, barely recovered from one civil war, teetered on the brink of another. But Dorn ultimately relented. After spending 7 days in meditation in the Pain Glove, a device used by the Imperial Fists to focus their thoughts through controlled suffering, he concluded that the Legion could no longer serve the Emperor who had been, and must serve the Emperor who was. The Emperor on the Golden Throne needed a different Imperium than the Emperor who had walked among his sons. Dorn accepted the Codex Astartes and divided his legion, though he did so with reluctance and sorrow. The Space Wolves never fully accepted the Codex. They attempted to create successor chapters, but the genetic instability of their gene seed made this difficult. The Wolf Brothers, their first and only successful successor chapter, suffered from terrible mutations and was eventually disbanded. The Space Wolves remained organized into great companies rather than the Codex standard companies, and they maintained many of their own traditions and practices. But they were a small legion to begin with, and their refusal to fully embrace the Codex was tolerated as an acceptable deviation. The Dark Angels and their successors presented a different kind of non-compliance. They divided into chapters as the Codex required, but they maintained secret ties to each other, coordinating their efforts in ways that effectively allowed them to operate as a legion when necessary. This was driven by their obsessive hunt for the fallen, Dark Angels who had turned traitor during the heresy. The Dark Angels' successors, collectively known as the Unforgiven, would drop everything to pursue rumors of the fallen, working together in ways that technically violated the spirit, if not the letter of the Codex. But despite these exceptions, the vast majority of Space Marine chapters adopted the Codex Astartes as their organizational and tactical guide. Some, like the Ultramarines themselves and most of their successors, followed it with near religious devotion,
treating every word as sacred wisdom that should never be questioned. Others took a more flexible approach, viewing the Codex as a set of guidelines rather than absolute rules, adapting its teachings to their own circumstances and preferences. But even these more independent chapters acknowledged the Codex's value and drew heavily on its wisdom. Over the millennia since the second founding, there have been many subsequent foundings of Space Marine chapters. Each time, the Adeptus Terra has created new chapters using gene seed from the genetic banks, assigning them homeworlds or fleets, and sending them forth to defend the Imperium. Most of these chapters have been founded using Ultramarines gene seed, which is considered the purest and most stable of all the Loyalist legions. As a result, it's estimated that roughly 2/3 of all Space Marine chapters are descended from the Ultramarines, either directly or through their successors. This genetic legacy has given the Ultramarines enormous influence within the Adeptus Astartes. When Space Marine commanders gather to discuss strategy, the Council of the Ultramarines is greatly valued. When a chapter needs assistance, the presence of even a small number of Ultramarines can ensure the participation of many other chapters. The Ultramarines are seen as exemplars, the standard against which other chapters are measured. Their adherence to the Codex Astartes, their record of service, their gene seed purity, all of these factors have made them the most respected chapter in the Imperium. But this respect has also bred resentment. Some chapters view the Ultramarines as arrogant, too convinced of their own superiority. The emphasis on Codex compliance can seem like an attempt to force all chapters into the same mold, to eliminate the diversity and individual character that makes each chapter unique. The fact that the Ultramarines Primarch wrote the Codex can make criticism of it feel like criticism of Guilliman himself, which many Ultramarines take personally. These tensions have occasionally erupted into conflict. The Black Templars, a successor chapter of the Imperial Fists known for their crusading zeal and disregard for the Codex's limit on chapter size, have clashed with Codex-compliant chapters over matters of doctrine and practice. The Space Wolves have a long-standing rivalry with the Dark Angels that has occasionally turned violent. Even among chapters that respect each other, there can be disagreements about the proper interpretation of the Codex's teachings. But these conflicts, while real, should not obscure the fundamental success of Guilliman's vision. The Codex Astartes has provided a framework that has allowed the Space Marines to function effectively for 10,000 years. It has prevented the kind of centralization of power that made the Horus Heresy possible. It has created a common culture and shared identity across thousands of chapters scattered across the galaxy. It has preserved the tactical and strategic wisdom of the Great Crusade and the Heresy, ensuring that each generation of Space Marines can learn from the experiences of those who came before. The Codex Astartes is, in many ways, Guilliman's greatest achievement. Not the battles he won, not the worlds he conquered, not even the Imperium Secundus he built, but this book. This collection of wisdom and doctrine that has shaped the Space Marines for 10 millennia. It is his legacy, his gift to the Imperium, his attempt to ensure that humanity's greatest defenders would never again become its greatest threat. Chapter 4: The Long Watch. For 10,000 years after the heresy, Roboute Guilliman was gone. Not dead, but not truly alive either. He had fallen in battle against his traitorous brother Fulgrim, the demon primarch of the Emperor's children, at the Battle of Thessaly in 121.M31. Fulgrim's poisoned blade had struck Guilliman down, and though the Primarch's superhuman physiology fought against the toxin, it was a battle he was slowly losing. The Ultramarines placed their dying Primarch in a stasis field, a technology that froze time within its boundaries, preventing the poison from completing its work, but also preventing any healing. Guilliman was enthroned in the Temple of Correction within the Fortress of Hera on Macragge, where he sat for 10 millennia. Neither dead nor alive, a monument to what the Imperium had lost. During those 10,000 years, the Ultramarines continued to follow the teachings of their Primarch. The Codex Astartes remained their sacred text, studied and memorized by every battle brother. The chapter's organization, tactics, and culture all reflected Guilliman's vision. They fought in countless wars, defended innumerable worlds, upheld the Imperium against every threat that arose. They remained, as they had always been, exemplars of what the Space Marines should be. But the Imperium itself changed in ways that would have horrified Guilliman. The secular, rational empire he had helped build became increasingly religious, with the Emperor worshipped as a god by billions of faithful. The Adeptus Ministorum, the Imperium's state church, grew to become one of the most powerful organizations in human space. The very thing the Emperor had fought against during the Great Crusade, the worship of him as divine, became the foundation of imperial culture. The Imperium also became more rigid, more bureaucratic, more resistant to change. Innovation was viewed with suspicion. New ideas were considered potential heresy. The standard template constructs, those repositories of technological knowledge from the dark age of technology, were lost or forgotten. Humanity's technological capability actually declined over the millennia, as knowledge was lost faster than it could be recovered. The Imperium of the 41st millennium was a pale shadow of what it had been during the Great Crusade, held together more by inertia and faith than by the vision and leadership that had built it. The Space Marines too changed. While the Codex Astartes provided a framework, each chapter developed its own culture and traditions. Some remained close to Guilliman's vision. Others drifted further away, developing practices and beliefs that would have seemed strange or even heretical to the Ultramarines of the Heresy era. The diversity of the Adeptus Astartes was both a strength and a weakness, allowing chapters to adapt to different threats and circumstances. but also creating divisions and rivalries that sometimes undermined cooperation. The Ultramarines themselves faced numerous challenges during this long period. They fought against the Tyranids when Hive Fleet Behemoth invaded the eastern fringe, losing their entire first company in the defense of Macragge, but ultimately turning back the Xenos threat. They battled Orcs, Chaos Space Marines, Dark Eldar, and every other enemy of humanity. They sent warriors to serve in the Death Watch, the chamber militant of the Ordo Xenos, where they shared their expertise with Space Marines from other chapters and learned from them in turn. Through all of this, the Ultramarines maintained their reputation as the exemplar chapter. Their chapter master, Marneus Calgar, was widely regarded as one of the greatest military leaders in the Imperium. Their first captain, Cato Sicarius, was a warrior of legendary skill and ambition. Their chief librarian, Tigerius, was one of the most powerful psychers in the Adeptus Astartes. The Ultramarines remained what they had always been: disciplined, effective, and utterly committed to the defense of humanity. But they did so without their Primarch's guidance. The Codex Astartes provided doctrine and organization, but it couldn't adapt to new threats or changing circumstances. It was a static document, written for the Imperium of the 31st Millennium, applied to the very different Imperium of the 41st. The Ultramarines followed it faithfully, but there were times when its teachings seemed inadequate, when the challenges they faced required solutions that Guilliman hadn't anticipated. This tension between adherence to the Codex and the need for adaptation was felt across the Adeptus Astartes. Some chapters argued for strict compliance, insisting that any deviation from the Codex was the first step toward heresy. Others advocated for flexibility, arguing that the Codex was meant to be a guide, not a straitjacket. The debate was never fully resolved, with different chapters taking different positions based on their own cultures and experiences. Then, in the closing years of the 41st Millennium, everything changed. The 13th Black Crusade, led by Abaddon the Despoiler, the War Master of Chaos, struck at the Cadian Gate, the stable warp route that connected the Eye of Terror to the rest of the galaxy. The forces of chaos poured through in numbers not seen since the Horus Heresy. Cadia, the fortress world that had guarded the gate for 10,000 years, fell. The planet was destroyed, shattered by the impact of a black stone fortress. And with its fall, the Great Rift was born. The Great Rift, also called the Cicatrix Maledictum, was a massive warp storm that split the galaxy in two. It was larger and more stable than any warp storm in recorded history, a permanent scar across reality that made warp travel impossible or suicidally dangerous across vast regions of space. Worlds on the wrong side of the rift were cut off from the Astronomicon, the psychic beacon that allowed warp navigation. Demons poured through the weakened barrier between the materium and the immaterium, the Imperium faced its greatest crisis since the Horus Heresy. And in this darkest hour, Roboute Guilliman returned. The circumstances of his resurrection were complex, involving the Adeptus Mechanicus Archmagos Belisarius Call, the Eldari Ynnari faction, and ancient technology and sorcery that pushed the boundaries of what was thought possible. Guilliman was healed of the poison that had kept him in stasis for 10 millennia. He awoke to find an Imperium vastly different from the one he had left, an Imperium that desperately needed his leadership. Guilliman's first priority was reaching Terra. He led a force through the galaxy, fighting his way past Chaos warbands, Xenos raiders, and every other threat that stood between him and the throne world. When he finally reached Terra and stood before the Golden Throne, he looked upon his father, the Emperor, and saw what 10,000 years had wrought. The Emperor was barely alive. His consciousness focused entirely on maintaining the Astronomicon and holding shut the webway breach. He could not speak, could not move, could barely acknowledge his son's presence. But Guilliman understood what needed to be done. The High Lords of Terra named him Lord Commander of the Imperium once more, giving him the authority he needed to reorganize the Imperium's defenses. He revealed the Primaris Space Marines, a new generation of Astartes, created by Archmagos Call using improved gene seed and additional implants. These warriors were larger, stronger, and more resilient than their predecessors, equipped with new weapons and armor that represented the first significant advancement in Space Marine technology in millennia. The Primaris Marines were organized into the Ultima Founding, the largest creation of new Space Marine chapters since the Second Founding. Thousands of new chapters were created, while existing chapters received Primaris reinforcements to bolster their numbers. The Adeptus Astartes, which had been slowly declining in numbers over the millennia, suddenly found itself reinforced with fresh warriors and new equipment. But the introduction of the Primaris Marines also required changes to the Codex Astartes. The new warriors didn't fit neatly into the organizational structure Guilliman had created 10,000 years earlier. They had different equipment, different capabilities, different tactical roles. The Codex needed to be updated, revised, adapted to account for these new realities. Guilliman undertook this revision personally. He didn't discard the Codex Astartes or declare it obsolete. Instead, he updated it, adding new sections while preserving the core principles that had served the Space Marines for 10 millennia. The revised codex maintained the chapter structure of 10 companies and 1,000 warriors, but it provided more flexibility in how those companies could be organized. It incorporated the Primaris Marines' new equipment and tactics while preserving the wisdom of the original text. This revision was controversial. Some chapters welcomed the updates, seeing them as necessary adaptations to new circumstances. Others resisted, arguing that the original codex was perfect as written and that any changes were tantamount to heresy. The fact that Guilliman himself was making the changes
complicated matters. How could you argue against the Primarch who had written the codex in the first place? But some chapters did argue, insisting that the codex, as it had been for 10,000 years, was sacred and should not be altered. Guilliman had little patience for such arguments. He had never intended the Codex to be a static, unchanging document. It was meant to be a living text, adapted and updated as circumstances required. The fact that it had become ossified, treated as holy writ that could never be questioned, was a symptom of the Imperium's broader problems. The Imperium had become rigid, resistant to change, more concerned with preserving tradition than with adapting to new threats. The Primarch launched the Indomitus Crusade, a massive military campaign aimed at stabilizing the Imperium in the wake of the Great Rift's opening. He led fleets across the galaxy, reinforcing beleaguered worlds, driving back chaos incursions, re-establishing contact with isolated systems. The Ultramarines fought at the forefront of this crusade, as they always had, exemplifying the principles of the Codex Astartes while adapting to the new realities of warfare in the era Indomitus. The Indomitus Crusade was a success, though the cost was high. Countless worlds were saved, but countless others were lost. The Imperium was stabilized, but it remained divided by the Great Rift, with the regions on the far side of the rift, the so-called Imperium Nihilis, cut off from Terra and forced to fend for themselves. The Adeptus Astartes was reinforced with Primaris Marines, but the integration of these new warriors into existing chapters was not always smooth. Through all of this, Guilliman remained committed to his vision of what the Space Marines should be. The Codex Astartes, in its revised form, continued to guide the Adeptus Astartes. The principles of discipline, duty, and selfless service that Guilliman had emphasized 10,000 years earlier remained as relevant as ever. The Space Marines were not conquerors or warlords. They were defenders of humanity, warriors who fought not for personal glory, but for the survival of the species. Chapter 5: Legacy and Lessons. The story of the Ultramarines and the Codex Astartes is, at its core, a story about leadership, vision, and the challenge of building institutions that can endure across millennia. Roboute Guilliman created something that outlasted him, that continued to shape the Imperium long after he was gone, that remained relevant even when the galaxy had changed beyond recognition. The Codex Astartes succeeded because it was comprehensive without being rigid, detailed without being inflexible. It provided a framework that could be adapted to different circumstances while maintaining core principles. It created a common culture across the Adeptus Astartes while allowing individual chapters to develop their own identities. It preserved the wisdom of the Great Crusade and the Heresy while remaining open to new insights and adaptations. But the Codex also revealed the limitations of any attempt to codify wisdom. No document, however comprehensive, can anticipate every situation. No set of rules, however well crafted, can substitute for judgment and leadership. The Codex Astartes was meant to be a guide, a starting point for thinking about how to organize and employ Space Marines. It was never meant to be a substitute for thought, a replacement for adaptation, a shield against the need to make difficult decisions. The Imperium's tendency to treat the Codex as holy writ, as a text that could never be questioned or updated, was a symptom of a broader problem. The Imperium of the 41st millennium had become ossified, resistant to change, more concerned with preserving tradition than with adapting to new threats. This rigidity was understandable. In a galaxy where innovation could lead to heresy, where new ideas might be corrupted by chaos, where change often meant disaster, conservatism was a survival strategy, but it was also a trap. An organization that cannot adapt will eventually be destroyed by circumstances it cannot handle. The Imperium survived for 10,000 years, not because it never changed, but because it changed slowly, grudgingly, only when absolutely necessary. The introduction of the Primaris Marines and the revision of the Codex Astartes represented one of those necessary changes, an adaptation to new realities that could not be ignored. The Ultramarines themselves embody both the strengths and the limitations of Guilliman's vision. They are disciplined, effective, reliable. They follow the Codex Astartes with a devotion that borders on religious fervor. They have served the Imperium faithfully for 10,000 years, fighting in countless wars, defending innumerable worlds, upholding the ideals that their Primarch instilled in them. But this devotion to the Codex has also made them, at times, inflexible. There have been situations where strict adherence to the Codex's teachings was counterproductive, where adaptation and innovation would have served better than following established doctrine. The Ultramarines' reputation for being by the book, while generally a strength, can also be a weakness when the book doesn't have an answer for the situation at hand. Other chapters have taken different approaches. The Space Wolves, with their disregard for the Codex's organizational structure, have developed a unique culture that emphasizes individual heroism and personal bonds between warriors. The Black Templars, with their crusading zeal and disregard for the Codex's limit on chapter size, have become one of the largest and most aggressive chapters in the Imperium. The Blood Angels, with their struggle against the genetic flaws in their gene seed, have developed a culture that emphasizes nobility and self-sacrifice in the face of inevitable doom. Each of these approaches has its merits. Each has produced chapters that have served the Imperium faithfully and effectively. The diversity of the Adeptus Astartes, the fact that different chapters have different cultures and approaches, is a strength. It means that the Space Marines as a whole can adapt to a wide variety of threats and circumstances, that there's always a chapter whose particular skills and approach are well suited to a given situation. But this diversity also creates tensions. Codex-compliant chapters sometimes view non-compliant chapters as undisciplined or even heretical. Non-compliant chapters sometimes view Codex-compliant chapters as rigid and unimaginative. These tensions occasionally erupt into conflict, though such conflicts are usually resolved before they escalate to actual violence. Guilliman's return has added a new dimension to these debates. The Primarch who wrote the Codex Astartes is now alive and active, leading the Imperium's military forces, revising his own work to account for new realities. His presence validates the Codex's importance, while also demonstrating that it was never meant to be unchanging. The Codex is a living document, meant to evolve as circumstances require. This has been a difficult lesson for some chapters to accept. For 10,000 years, the Codex Astartes was treated as the final word on how Space Marines should be organized and employed. Now, its author is saying that it needs to be updated, that the old ways, while valuable, are not sufficient for the challenges the Imperium faces. This requires a shift in thinking, an acknowledgement that tradition, while important, cannot be allowed to become an obstacle to necessary change. The Ultramarines, as Guilliman's own chapter, have embraced this shift more readily than most. They have integrated Primaris Marines into their ranks, adopted the new equipment and tactics, revised their understanding of the Codex to account for Guilliman's updates. They remain committed to the principles their Primarch instilled in them, but they have also demonstrated the flexibility to adapt when adaptation is necessary. This balance between tradition and innovation, between adherence to established doctrine and willingness to change when circumstances require it, is perhaps the most important lesson of the Ultramarines story. Organizations that cannot change will eventually fail, but organizations that change too readily, that abandon their core principles in pursuit of novelty, will lose their identity and purpose. The challenge is to maintain core values while adapting methods, to preserve what is essential while discarding what is merely traditional. The Codex Astartes, in both its original and revised forms, represents Guilliman's attempt to provide this balance. It establishes core principles that should not be abandoned: discipline, duty, selfless service, the subordination of personal ambition to the greater good. But it also provides flexibility in how those principles are applied, acknowledging that different situations require different approaches, that there is no single right way to organize or employ Space Marines. The Ultramarines' adherence to the Codex, their reputation as exemplars of what the Space Marines should be, has made them both respected and resented. They are held up as the standard against which other chapters are measured, which creates pressure and resentment. But they have also earned this position through 10,000 years of faithful service, through their willingness to fight and die for the Imperium, through their commitment to the ideals that Guilliman instilled in them. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, the Ultramarines stand as a beacon of what humanity can achieve. They are not perfect. They have made mistakes, suffered defeats, failed to live up to their own ideals at times. But they have also demonstrated again and again that discipline and organization, that adherence to principle and willingness to adapt, that commitment to something greater than oneself, can make a difference, even in a galaxy that seems determined to destroy humanity. The Codex Astartes is Roboute Guilliman's gift to the Imperium, his attempt to ensure that the Space Marines would remain effective defenders of humanity for as long as the Imperium endured. It has succeeded beyond what even Guilliman might have hoped, shaping the Adeptus Astartes for 10,000 years. Providing a framework that has allowed the Space Marines to function effectively across a galaxy-spanning empire. But the Codex's true value lies not in its specific prescriptions, not in its organizational charts or tactical doctrines, but in the principles it embodies.
the idea that warriors should be disciplined and organized, the belief that individual glory is less important than the mission's success, the understanding that effective military force requires not just courage and skill, but also logistics, planning, and coordination. The recognition that the purpose of military power is to protect, not to conquer, to serve humanity rather than to dominate it. These principles, more than any specific tactical doctrine or organizational structure, are Guilliman's legacy. They are what the Ultramarines have preserved and exemplified for 10 millennia. They are what the Codex Astartes, in all its versions and interpretations, is ultimately about. And they are what will continue to guide the Space Marines, the Ultramarines, and all their brother chapters as they face the challenges of the era Indomitus and whatever comes after. Conclusion: courage and honor. The Ultramarines' battle cry is simple: courage and honor. Two words that encapsulate everything the chapter stands for, everything that Roboute Guilliman tried to instill in his sons. Courage, not just physical bravery in the face of danger, but moral courage, the willingness to do what is right even when it is difficult. Honor, not just personal reputation, but commitment to duty, to the Imperium, to the ideals that the Space Marines are supposed to embody. These are not easy virtues to maintain. In a galaxy where survival often requires compromise, where the enemy uses every dirty trick and forbidden weapon, where the line between necessary pragmatism and moral corruption can be dangerously thin, maintaining courage and honor requires constant vigilance. It would be easier to abandon these principles, to fight as brutally as the enemy, to use any means necessary to achieve victory. But the Ultramarines have never taken the easy path. For 10,000 years, they have held themselves to a higher standard, have insisted that how you fight matters as much as whether you win. They have demonstrated that discipline and organization, that adherence to principle and commitment to duty are not weaknesses, but strengths. That warriors who fight for something greater than themselves, who subordinate their egos to the mission, who value their brothers' lives and the lives of those they protect, are more effective than warriors who fight only for personal glory. This is the lesson of the Ultramarines. This is the wisdom of the Codex Astartes. This is Roboute Guilliman's legacy to the Imperium. In a galaxy of endless war, where humanity faces threats that would break lesser species, the Ultramarines stand as proof that civilization can endure, that order can be maintained, that there is still room for courage and honor, even in the grim darkness of the far future. The Ultramarines are not perfect. No chapter is. They have their flaws, their failures, their moments of doubt and defeat. But they endure, they adapt, they continue to fight, generation after generation, century after century, millennium after millennium. They are the sons of Guilliman, the exemplars of the Codex Astartes, the defenders of humanity. And as long as they draw breath, they stand. As long as they stand, they fight. As long as they fight, they prevail. Nothing shall stay their wrath. For Macragge, for the Emperor, for humanity, courage and honor. Thank you for joining me on this exploration of the Ultramarines and the Codex Astartes. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the lore of Warhammer 40,000, please consider subscribing to the channel. Until next time, may the Emperor protect, and may you find courage and honor in whatever battles you face.